The Rebirth of Athens, from Ashes to Immortal Glory. Prologue. The smoldering ruins of a dream. The autumn wind of 479 BCE carried the acrid smell of destruction across what had once been Athens. When the first refugees began their hesitant return from Salamis and Trozen, from the mountain caves of Attica and the temporary shelters where they had hidden during the Persian occupation, they found themselves standing in a cityscape that seemed to mock their memories. Where the agora had bustled with merchants and philosophers, there remained only blackened stone and collapsed colonnades. The residential quarters that had climbed the slopes toward the Acropolis were fields of rubble walls reduced to waist height, roofs utterly vanished, household shrines desecrated and destroyed. An elderly merchant named Aristogeiton, who had fled with his family to Trozen 9 months earlier when Themistocles convinced the Athenian assembly to evacuate the city, later recalled the moment he first saw his ancestral home. "The walls still stood," he told his grandchildren decades later, "but they were blackened shells, and when I stepped through the doorway, I could see the sky where our roof had been. My wife wept. My mother, who was with us, could not weep. She simply stood there, looking at the courtyard where she had raised 5 children, and she made no sound at all." The Persians had thrown down the altar to Zeus Herkios, the protector of our household. The loom where my wife had woven for 15 years was ash. Everything that could burn had burned. Everything that could be broken was broken. This scene repeated itself thousands of times across Athens in the weeks following the final Greek victory at Plataea. Families returned to find homes destroyed, businesses ruined, sacred groves cut down, and temples desecrated. The Athenians had won a tremendous victory. They had defeated the largest invasion force the world had ever seen, had proven that free citizens could stand against the armies of a vast empire. But their city lay in ruins, and the future was terrifyingly uncertain. Yet within this devastation lay the seeds of something remarkable. The destruction was so complete, the slate so thoroughly wiped clean, that Athens had an opportunity that few cities in history have ever possessed: the chance to reimagine and rebuild itself from first principles. The question was not whether Athens would survive Greek determination and Persian defeat had settled that. The question was what Athens would become. Part 1. Survival and Defense, 479–461 BCE. Chapter 1. Themistocles and the Walls that Changed History. In the immediate aftermath of the Persian withdrawal, Athens faced an existential paradox. The city had led the Greek resistance, its navy had been decisive at Salamis, and its soldiers had fought bravely at Plataea. But Athens itself was defenseless, its walls destroyed, its population scattered, its resources depleted. Meanwhile, Sparta, supposedly Athens' ally in the war against Persia, was rapidly becoming a rival, suspicious of Athens' growing power and influence. Themistocles, the brilliant and controversial strategos who had masterminded the naval strategy that defeated Xerxes, immediately understood the strategic situation. In late 479 or early 478 BCE, he came before the Athenian assembly with a proposal that was as bold as it was necessary. Athens must rebuild its walls immediately, before Sparta or any other power could prevent it. The walls must be strong enough to protect the city, high enough to deter assault, and extensive enough to encompass the entire urban area that Athens would need for its recovery and growth. The proposal faced immediate foreign opposition. A Spartan embassy, arrived in Athens in early 478 BCE with a request that seemed reasonable but concealed a strategic trap. The Spartans argued that no Greek city should have walls because fortified cities could serve as bases if the Persians ever invaded again. Better that all cities remain unwalled, so that if Persia returned, there would be no strongholds for the invaders to seize. The argument had a superficial logic, except that it would leave Athens permanently vulnerable, while Sparta itself remained protected by its formidable army and the mountains of the Peloponnese. Themistocles' response was a masterpiece of diplomatic deception and strategic boldness. He volunteered to travel to Sparta to discuss the matter, thereby buying time. Meanwhile, he sent secret messages to Athens. Begin building the walls immediately, using every available person, incorporating whatever materials lie at hand, and work with absolute speed. The Athenian assembly, trusting Themistocles, approved the plan. What followed was one of the most remarkable construction efforts in ancient history. Every Athenian who could lift stone became a builder. Citizens and metics, free men and slaves, men and women, even children, all joined in the desperate work of constructing defensive walls before Sparta could intervene. The historian Thucydides, writing decades later, preserved an account of this extraordinary moment. The Athenians set to work, the whole population, men, women, and children, taking part in the building. They spared no structure, public or private, that could be useful for the work, but demolished everything. On every side of the city, the work went forward, and the circuit was extended to enclose the whole area that seemed necessary for defense. The building was carried on without interruption, the workers laboring day and night. The resulting walls were unlike anything previously built in Greece. They incorporated everything column drums from the temples destroyed by the Persians, funerary monuments pulled from their places, blocks from demolished houses, even sculptures and architectural ornaments. An archaic Kouros statue, a grave stele showing a family farewell, a section of fluted column from the old temple of Athena. All were built into the hastily constructed fortifications. These walls became, in a sense, a monument to the destruction Athens had survived, with pieces of the old city literally incorporated into the structure that would protect the new one. Modern archaeologists, excavating sections of the Themistoclean walls, as they came to be called, can still trace this history. At one location, a beautiful marble grave relief showing a woman seated, holding a jewelry box while her maid stands nearby, was found built sideways into the fortification. A poignant reminder that personal tragedy and family memory were sacrificed to the urgent need for collective security. At another point, column drums from an archaic temple were stacked horizontally, one atop another, their fluted surfaces visible in the wall-face architectural elements designed to soar vertically, now serving horizontal defensive purposes. The work proceeded with frantic speed for several months. In Sparta, Themistocles continued his diplomatic stalling. When Spartan officials became suspicious and confronted him with reports that Athens was building walls, despite the agreement to discuss the matter, Themistocles expressed shock and disbelief. "Surely these are false rumors spread by Athens' enemies," he protested. "Send envoys to Athens to investigate if you doubt my word. But be assured that Athens seeks only what is best for all Greece." The Spartans, trained in military strategy, but less experienced in diplomatic duplicity, agreed to send investigators. Themistocles immediately sent word to Athens, "Detain the Spartan envoys politely but firmly, and ensure the walls reach a defensible height before they are released." The Athenians complied. When the Spartan investigators arrived, they found themselves honored guests who were somehow never quite able to get permission to inspect the walls, who found their movements subtly constrained, and who kept receiving assurances that they would be able to make their inspection tomorrow, certainly tomorrow. By the time the walls reached a defensible height, perhaps 5 or 6 meters, enough to prevent easy assault, Themistocles revealed what had been accomplished. The Spartans were furious, but there was nothing they could do. Athens was now protected by formidable fortifications that stretched nearly 6 kilometers in circumference, enclosing the entire urban area and providing defense in depth against any conventional assault. But Themistocles was not finished. He understood that walls around Athens itself, while necessary, were insufficient for the city's long-term security and prosperity. Athens's future lay on the sea in trade, in naval power, and in the ability to import grain and resources, even if the Attic countryside were overrun by enemies. This meant that Piraeus, Athens' natural harbor, located about 7 kilometers southwest of the city, must also be fortified and developed into the greatest port in the Mediterranean. Between 478 and 471 BCE, while also serving as a commander in the Delian League's operations against Persian strongholds, Themistocles pushed forward a massive fortification and development program at Piraeus. The harbor's entrance was narrowed and protected by breakwaters. Defensive walls were constructed around the harbor area. Ship sheds were built to house Athens' growing fleet of triremes-long covered buildings where the precious warships could be stored, maintained, and protected when not at sea. Warehouses were constructed to store grain, timber, and other imports. Commercial facilities were expanded to accommodate the merchants who were beginning to make Piraeus their base. The vision was revolutionary. Athens and Piraeus would become essentially a single strategic entity, connected not just by the road between them, but by their integration into a maritime-based economic and military system. If enemies invaded Attica, Athenians could retreat behind their walls, supplied by sea through Piraeus. If Piraeus were threatened, the Athenian army could march to its defense. Together, the fortified city and fortified port would make Athens nearly invulnerable as long as it maintained naval supremacy. Chapter 2. The Painful Decade Rebuilding Lives Amid Uncertainty, 478-468 BCE. While walls and harbors represented strategic necessities, ordinary Athenians faced the immediate grinding challenge of rebuilding their lives. For most citizens, the decade following the Persian withdrawal was a period of hard work, modest progress, and persistent uncertainty. The city that emerged during these years bore little resemblance to the magnificent Athens that would appear a generation later. It was functional, austere, focused on survival rather than splendor. Housing was rebuilt in the simplest, most economical style. The typical Athenian house of this period was modest, almost to the point of poverty mud brick walls on stone foundations, small windows, an interior courtyard open to the sky, and a roof of clay tiles if the owner could afford them, or thatch if he could not. A citizen named Lycon, whose family had been prosperous merchants before the war, described his rebuilt home to a visiting cousin. "We have 4 rooms around the courtyard, which is enough for my wife, my mother, 3 children, and myself. The Andron men's room, where we entertain guests, is small. We can accommodate perhaps 6 couches for dining, no more. My father's house had twice the space, and the courtyard had a colonnade with painted decoration. We had a separate kitchen building. All that is gone. This is what we can afford now, and we are grateful to have it. The streets remained irregular and narrow, following the patterns established by property boundaries that had existed before the destruction. There was no grand urban planning, no systematic redesign of the city's layout. Athens grew organically, somewhat chaotically, as individual families rebuilt on their ancestral plots. The result was a city that, while protected by impressive walls, was internally a jumbled maze of narrow lanes, cramped houses, and limited public spaces, very different from the regular planned cities that Greek colonists were building in Sicily and southern Italy during the same period. The Agora Athens' central marketplace and civic center gradually resumed its functions, but in diminished form. The stoas, covered colonnades that had provided shelter for merchants and space for informal conversation, were not immediately rebuilt. Instead, temporary structures and open-air stalls served for commerce. Public officials conducted business from simple buildings or even outdoors. The atmosphere was utilitarian rather than inspiring. An Athenian orator later contrasted this period with earlier times. Our fathers, after they defeated the Persians, lived simply. They rebuilt their homes modestly. They did not immediately seek luxury or decoration. They understood that survival and security came before splendor. Economic recovery was gradual and uneven. Athenian agriculture had been devastated by the Persian invasion and occupation. The olive groves that had been Attica's agricultural wealth trees, that took decades to reach productive maturity, had been systematically destroyed by Persian forces. New olive trees were planted, but it would be a generation before they reached full productivity. In the meantime, Athenians relied increasingly on imported grain, particularly from the Black Sea region, paid for by silver from the mines at Laurion, and by the growing tribute from the Delian League. The Laurion silver mines, located in southeastern Attica, became increasingly important to Athens' recovery and growth. These mines had existed for generations, but after the Persian Wars, they were exploited more systematically and intensively. The work was brutal enslaved laborers, many of them captured in various military campaigns, worked in narrow shafts and galleries, sometimes hundreds of feet underground, extracting silver-bearing ore that was then processed at the surface. The profits went to wealthy Athenians who leased mining rights from the state, but a significant portion of the revenue flowed to the Athenian treasury through lease payments and taxes. This silver funded multiple priorities simultaneously: maintaining and expanding the navy. Each trireme cost about a talent to build and required constant maintenance. Supporting democratic institutions, paying stipends to citizens serving in various official capacities, and gradually accumulating resources for public building projects. The mines at Laurion were, in a very real sense, the economic foundation of Athens' golden age. Though that foundation rested on the suffering of thousands of enslaved workers whose names are lost to history. Religious life during this period centered on maintaining traditional festivals and making modest offerings at makeshift shrines. The great temples destroyed by the Persians remained in ruins. The Athenians had taken an oath not to rebuild temples that the Persians had destroyed, leaving them as monuments to barbarian sacrilege. Religious ceremonies therefore took place at outdoor altars, at small shrines that had escaped destruction, or in temporary structures. The annual festivals continued, the Panathenaea in honor of Athena, the city Dionysia with its dramatic competitions, the Eleusinian mysteries, but in reduced circumstances compared to pre-war celebrations. This was also a period of significant social change. The war had demonstrated the importance of the common citizens who rowed the ships, the Thetes, Athens' poorest class, who owned little or no property. Before the Persian Wars, political power in Athens had been concentrated among the wealthier classes who could afford hoplite armor and fight as heavy infantry. But at Salamis, it was the Thetes, manning the oars of the triremes, who had saved Greece. This military contribution translated into political leverage. Themistocles and other democratic leaders argued that those who defended the city should have full participation in governing it. The reforms that followed strengthened Athenian democracy considerably. The Areopagus, an aristocratic council that had held significant power, saw its authority reduced in favor of the popular assembly and the law courts where all citizens could participate. Pay for jury service was introduced, allowing poor citizens to serve without losing their daily wages. The office of strategos, general, became increasingly important, and these positions were filled by election rather than lot, creating a system where political and military leadership could be combined in talented individuals regardless of their family background. A citizen named Telecles, a carpenter who had fought at Marathon and rowed at Salamis, expressed the new democratic spirit in his testimony before a jury around 470 BCE. "I am not rich. I own no land except the small plot where my house stands. I work with my hands for wages. But I fought for Athens, and my father fought before me. When the assembly debates, I have the right to speak, not just the right, but the duty. When juries are selected, I may be called to judge cases involving the wealthiest men in Athens. This is what we fought for, not just to keep the Persians out, but to keep Athens free and ourselves free within it." Chapter 3. The Delian League and the Flow of Silver, 477-454 BCE. The establishment of the Delian League in 478-477 BCE created a new source of revenue that would eventually make Athens' cultural flowering possible. Initially, the League was genuinely a defensive alliance, Greek cities voluntarily joining together to maintain a fleet strong enough to deter Persian aggression and liberate Greek cities still under Persian control. Athens provided the largest naval contingent and most of the military leadership, but the alliance was nominally one of equals, with decisions made collectively and tribute assessed fairly by Aristides the Just. The initial tribute assessment established by Aristides amounted to 460 talents annually, an enormous sum representing perhaps 12 million drachmas or roughly 12 million days of skilled labor. This money went into a common treasury housed on the sacred island of Delos, administered by officials called Hellenotamiai, Greek treasurers, who were initially drawn from various member states. The funds were designated exclusively for common defense, building ships, paying rowers, maintaining fleets, and conducting military operations against Persian positions. For the first 2 decades of the League's existence, this system functioned more or less as intended. Athens led military expeditions that achieved significant successes. In 476 BCE, the Athenian general Cimon captured Ion at the mouth of the Strymon River in Thrace, expelling a Persian garrison and liberating a strategically important site. In 475 BCE, League forces cleared Skyros of pirates who had been raiding Aegean shipping. In 470 BCE, Cimon won a spectacular double victory at the Eurymedon River in southern Asia Minor, destroying Persian naval and land forces simultaneously, and demonstrating that Persia remained a genuine threat that justified the League's continued existence. The revenue flowing through Athens from the League treasury began to have economic effects even before that treasury was moved to Athens itself. Athenian shipyards expanded to build and maintain the growing fleet. More Athenians found employment as rowers. Each trireme required 170 oarsmen, and Athens' fleet numbered well over 200 ships by the 460s BCE, meaning more than 30,000 rowing positions that needed to be filled. While not all rowers were Athenian citizens, metics and even hired foreigners sometimes rowed, the fleet provided steady employment for thousands of poorer Athenians. The import of grain and other goods increased, as Athens used its naval power to protect trade routes and its silver to purchase necessities. The population of Athens and Piraeus began to grow as people from throughout Attica moved to the urban area seeking economic opportunities. Metics' foreign residents arrived in increasing numbers, attracted by Athens's commercial vitality and democratic culture. These metics could not vote or own land, but they could engage in commerce, practice crafts, and participate in many aspects of Athenian cultural life. By the 460s BCE, Athens was noticeably more prosperous than it had been immediately after the war. Houses were being rebuilt more substantially. Some wealthier citizens were constructing homes with painted decoration and more elaborate architectural details. The agora was busier, with more permanent shops replacing temporary stalls. New workshops were established in the city and in Piraeus, producing pottery, metalwork, leather goods, and textiles for both local consumption and export. However, the temples on the Acropolis remained ruins dramatic, deliberate ruins. The oath not to rebuild them until Persia was definitively defeated had been taken seriously. The blackened columns of the old temple of Athena stood as constant reminders of Persian sacrilege and Greek determination. When Athenians looked up at the Acropolis, they saw not splendor, but destruction, not triumph, but the price that had been paid for freedom. This conspicuous devastation served political purposes. It kept alive the justification for the Delian League and the continued military operations against Persia. Part 2. The vision takes form. 461-450 BCE. Chapter 4. Pericles emerges, a new kind of leader. In 461 BCE, Athenian politics underwent a dramatic shift. Cimon, the aristocratic general who had led the Delian League's military operations and favored friendly relations with Sparta, was ostracized, temporarily exiled for 10 years by popular vote. His departure cleared the way for a new generation of leaders, and at the forefront of this generation was Pericles, son of Xanthippus. Pericles was approximately 34 years old in 461 BCE, having been born around 495 BCE into one of Athens' most distinguished families. His father Xanthippus had commanded Athenian forces at the Battle of Mycale in 479 BCE, helping to complete the defeat of the Persian invasion. His mother, Agariste, belonged to the Alcmaeonid clan, one of the most politically prominent families in Athens, which had produced the democratic reformer Cleisthenes and had been involved in Athenian politics for generations. By birth and family connection, Pericles was unmistakably a member of Athens' aristocratic elite. Yet Pericles' politics were thoroughly democratic, not the limited democracy of an earlier era, where aristocrats competed for popular support while maintaining traditional hierarchies, but a radical democracy where even the poorest citizens had genuine political power. This combination aristocratic background and democratic conviction shaped Pericles' entire career. He could move easily in elite circles, understanding the perspectives and interests of wealthy, educated Athenians. But he consistently championed policies that strengthened democratic institutions and expanded political participation. Contemporary descriptions of Pericles emphasized his unusual personality and style of leadership. Unlike most Athenian politicians, who cultivated popularity through frequent public appearances, jovial interaction with citizens in the agora, and emotional appeals in assembly speeches, Pericles was reserved, dignified, almost aloof. He appeared in public primarily for official purposes. He rarely attended private dinner parties or engaged in the casual socializing that was typical of Athenian political life. When he spoke in the assembly, his oratory was carefully composed, logical and structured, rather than emotional and improvised. The comic playwright Aristophanes, writing decades later, but drawing on stories told by older Athenians, described Pericles as possessing Zeus-like authority. He could thunder and lighten in debate, overwhelming opponents with the force of his arguments. Other sources mention that Pericles' head was unusually elongated, and that he was sensitive about this physical peculiarity, almost always wearing a helmet in portraits and public appearances. Opponents mockingly called him Squill Head, after an onion-like plant. But these jibes couldn't diminish his political dominance. What made Pericles historically significant was not just his political skill or his oratory, but his vision. He saw Athens not merely as a powerful polis or as the leader of a military alliance, but as something unprecedented, a city that would combine political freedom, economic prosperity, and cultural excellence in ways that would make it the intellectual and artistic center of the Greek world. Athens would become, in a phrase Pericles himself would use in his funeral oration in 431 BCE, an education to Greece, a city whose very existence would demonstrate what free people could achieve. This vision had multiple dimensions. Politically, Athens would be the exemplar of democracy, proving that government by the people could be stable, effective, and just. Economically, Athens would be prosperous and powerful, dominating Mediterranean trade and wielding naval supremacy. Militarily, Athens would lead the Greek world in defending Hellenic freedom against barbarian threats. But most ambitiously, culturally, Athens would surpass all other cities in art, architecture, drama, philosophy, and every form of intellectual and aesthetic achievement. Realizing this vision required far more resources than Athens possessed from its own territory and citizens. It required the tribute of the Delian League, transformed from a fund for common defense into revenue that Athens could direct toward its own greatness. It required the labor of craftsmen and artists drawn from throughout the Greek world. And it required decades of sustained effort to transform the still modest city of the 460s BCE into the glittering metropolis that Pericles envisioned. Chapter 5. The Peace with Persia and the Treasury's Move, 444-449 BCE. In 454 BCE, a catastrophe provided Pericles with an opportunity. An Athenian expedition supporting an Egyptian revolt against Persian rule ended in complete disaster. The Persian king Artaxerxes I had sent a large army to Egypt that surrounded and ultimately destroyed the Athenian and allied forces. Perhaps 200 ships and tens of thousands of men were lost, one of Athens's worst military defeats ever. The disaster sent shockwaves through Athens and the Delian League. If such a large force could be destroyed so completely, what did this say about the safety of the League's treasury on Delos? The island, while sacred, was relatively undefended and potentially vulnerable to Persian raid. Pericles and his supporters argued that the treasury must be moved to Athens for safekeeping, specifically to the Athenian Acropolis, where it would be protected by the city's walls and garrison. The decision to move the treasury was presented as a security measure, necessitated by the Egyptian disaster and the ongoing Persian threat. In reality, it represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the League. Delos had been chosen as the League's center precisely because it was neutral ground, a sacred island where all member states could meet as equals. Moving the treasury to Athens made unmistakably clear what had been gradually happening for years. The League was becoming an Athenian empire, and the tribute was becoming Athenian revenue. Not all League members accepted this transformation passively. Some cities, recognizing what the move meant, protested or withheld tribute. Athens' response was uncompromising. Military force compelled compliance. The pattern established earlier with Naxos and Thasos, continued rebellion meant siege, defeat, increased tribute, and loss of autonomy. By the mid-450s BCE, only the largest islands, Chios, Lesbos, and Samos, still maintained their own fleets and a measure of genuine autonomy. The rest had been reduced to tributary subjects of Athens. Around 449 BCE, the exact date is debated, Athens apparently made peace with Persia, the so-called Peace of Callias. The terms, if the peace actually occurred, ancient sources disagree, involved Persia recognizing the freedom of Greek cities in Asia Minor and the Aegean, while Athens agreed not to conduct military operations in areas under Persian control. Whether formal or informal, a peace understanding seems to have been reached by the late 450s BCE. This peace, paradoxically, strengthened rather than weakened Athens' control over its empire. The original justification for the Delian League defense against Persia was now accomplished. Cities might reasonably argue that with peace achieved, the League should be dissolved and tribute payments ceased. But Athens was not about to surrender its empire simply because the war that had occasioned it was over. Instead, Athenian orators argued that eternal vigilance was necessary, that peace with Persia was fragile, and that maintaining the fleet remained essential for protecting Greek interests. More honestly, Pericles and other Athenian leaders argued that the League had evolved into something more than a military alliance. It had become a system of collective security and shared prosperity that benefited all members. Athens provided not just military protection, but suppression of piracy, enforcement of commercial law, protection of trade routes, and access to Athenian markets. The tribute was not merely payment for defense, but contribution to public goods from which all League members benefited. These arguments convinced few of Athens' allies, but were sufficient for Athenian citizens, who voted in assembly after assembly to maintain the empire, collect the tribute, and use those resources for Athens' benefit. The treasury sitting on the Acropolis represented perhaps 5,000 talents, a staggering accumulation of wealth that opened extraordinary possibilities. Chapter 6. The Great Debate Should Athens Build? 450-447 BCE. With peace, or at least reduced military operations, and with substantial financial resources available, the question arose, what should Athens do with its wealth? Pericles had an answer. Athens should embark on the most ambitious public building program in Greek history, creating temples, monuments, and public buildings that would surpass anything previously constructed and would demonstrate Athenian cultural superiority to the entire Greek world. The proposal ignited fierce political debate. Conservative Athenians, led by Thucydides, son of Milesius, not the historian, but a prominent aristocrat and political rival of Pericles, opposed using league funds for Athenian building projects. Their arguments were both principled and practical. As a matter of justice, they argued, the allies contributed tribute for defense, not decoration. Using those funds to build temples in Athens was misappropriation, essentially theft from the allies who had no voice in how their money was spent. As a practical matter, it was politically provocative. Many allies already resented Athenian domination, and such obvious appropriation of league funds for purely Athenian purposes would increase that resentment, potentially leading to revolts that would require military suppression and further expense. Moreover, Thucydides and his supporters argued such extravagant spending on temples and public buildings was inappropriate for a democracy. It smacked of tyranny, the sort of magnificent building programs that tyrants had undertaken in earlier generations to glorify themselves and overawe their subjects. Democratic Athens should not imitate tyrannical excess. Better to spend modestly on necessities, reduce the tribute burden on allies, and perhaps even distribute surplus funds to Athenian citizens. The debate played out over several years in the Athenian assembly, with Thucydides leading the opposition and speaking eloquently against Pericles' proposals. According to Plutarch, who preserved accounts of these debates, Thucydides famously declared, "The Athenians are losing their reputation and disgracing themselves by transferring from Delos to Athens the funds contributed by the Greeks for the war against Persia. Now that Athens has appropriated these funds, the Athenians are dressing up their city like a vain woman, hanging it with expensive stones and statues and 1,000-talent temples." Pericles' response combined pragmatic arguments with an inspiring vision that appealed to Athenian pride and ambition. He first addressed the practical concerns. Athens, he argued, did provide the services for which allies paid: protection from external threats, suppression of piracy, enforcement of law, and facilitation of trade. How Athens chose to use the revenue generated by those services was Athens' own business, so long as the services continued to be provided. The allies had no more right to dictate how Athens spent tribute money than workers had to tell an employer how to spend profits, so long as the workers received agreed wages. But Pericles' more powerful arguments were positive rather than defensive. A great building program, he argued, would provide employment for thousands of Athenians. Every craft and trade would benefit stone workers and sculptors, carpenters and metal workers, painters and plasterers, merchants and laborers. The projects would distribute wealth throughout the citizen body, stimulating the economy and providing opportunities for ordinary Athenians to earn good wages in honorable work. Beyond economics, Pericles appealed to Athenian pride and ambition. Athens was now the greatest city in Greece, the wealthiest, the most powerful, the most democratic. Should it not also be the most beautiful? Should it not create monuments worthy of its achievements? The temples destroyed by the Persians had been modest structures by the standards of the 450s BCE. The new temples would be magnificent, demonstrating that Athens had not merely recovered from the Persian destruction, but had surpassed its former condition. These buildings would honor the gods appropriately, provide physical expression of Athenian culture and values, and inspire citizens and visitors alike. Pericles also made an argument that resonated with democratic sensibilities. Traditionally, great architecture had been the province of aristocrats and tyrants, wealthy individuals, building to glorify themselves. But in democratic Athens, great architecture would be created by the people, for the people, celebrating not individuals, but the collective achievements of free citizens. The temples and monuments would belong to all Athenians equally, visible testimony to what democracy could accomplish. Finally, Pericles understood the power of legacy. These buildings, he argued, will stand for generations. Long after we are dead, long after current political disputes are forgotten, Athenians yet unborn will walk among these temples and take pride in what their ancestors created. We have the opportunity to build something immortal. Should we refuse it because of excessive caution or penny-pinching calculation? The debate reached its climax around 448-447 BCE. Thucydides called for a vote of ostracism, a procedure where citizens could vote to temporarily exile a political leader. The ostracism was held, and Thucydides lost decisively. He was sent into exile for 10 years, effectively ending organized opposition to Pericles' building program. The way was clear. Athens would build. During Part 3, the Great Building begins, 447-432 BCE. Chapter 7. Gathering the Talent, the Migration of Masters. When word spread throughout the Greek world that Athens was embarking on an unprecedented building program, with substantial funds allocated and projects that would last for decades, it triggered a migration of skilled workers unlike anything previously seen in Greek history. From every corner of the Mediterranean, craftsmen, artists, and laborers made their way to Athens, drawn by the promise of employment, the opportunity to work on magnificent projects, and the reputation and wages that such work could bring. From the islands of the Aegean came marble workers who understood stone with an intimacy born of generations of family tradition. The island of Paros was particularly famous for its marble, a brilliant white stone with a subtle translucence that made it ideal for sculpture. Entire families of Parian marble workers traveled to Athens, bringing tools, techniques, and aesthetic traditions developed over centuries. They could look at a block of marble and visualize the figure within it, could calculate exactly where to place the chisel to reveal the form they envisioned, could polish the surface to a smoothness that seemed impossible in stone. From Naxos came workers skilled in a slightly different marble, with warm tones that complemented Parian white. From Pentelikon, the mountain northeast of Athens itself, came workers who would quarry and shape the distinctive marble that would become synonymous with Athenian architecture, a beautiful white stone with subtle veins of iron that would give it a warm, golden tone as it aged over centuries. The sculptors who arrived in Athens in the late 440s BCE represented multiple traditions and generations. There were old masters trained in the severe, archaic style sculptors who had learned their craft before the Persian Wars, who specialized in the formal frontal poses and mysterious smiles of archaic art. These elder artists brought refinement and precision, an understanding of proportions and symmetry that came from decades of practice. But there were also young sculptors, hungry to experiment with new approaches. They wanted to capture actual human movement, the complex torsion of a body in motion, the subtle emotions visible in a face. They studied anatomy systematically, understanding how muscles connected, how skin draped over bone, how weight distribution affected posture. They were developing what would come to be called the classical style naturalistic, yet idealized, recognizably human, yet perfected beyond what any actual human could be. Among these young revolutionary sculptors were men whose names would become legendary. Polykleitos, working in the Peloponnese, but whose influence reached Athens, was developing his canon, a mathematical system of proportions for representing the ideal human body. Myron was creating sculptures that captured motion, frozen in time,